Welcome to Tesla Field Physics, the most suppressed channel on YouTube. I'm Mike Telasky. Let's get started. In this video, I'd like to tell the story of Element 115, Bob Lazar, John Lear, Gene Huff, George Knapp, and Jeremy Corbell. To understand this whole thing, we have to go back basically to the beginning to see how all these ties fit together so you can understand how long they've been trying to figure this out and put all the pieces together up until now, and how everything that Bob Lazar was saying is proven to be true, just like I knew it was from the beginning. I followed this story since I was a kid. I always believed in Bob and the stuff that John Lear was saying. John got kind of far out there with his stuff toward the end of his life, but when he was coming up, that guy held every single aviation certificate that you could get. He had them all on his wall, everything from a flight controller to the mechanic who could fix the engines in the planes. So he had every one that you could get. He was a world famous pilot when he started his career, basically flying for different airlines and then for the CIA. So to begin the story, John Lear is the son of Bill Lear. Bill Lear is the inventor of the Lear jet. Bill Lear owned the Lear Corporation, Learjet Corporation. So when John was younger, he had this friend of the family that would always come over, and his name was Jimmy Doolittle. And nobody really knew a whole lot about him. There wasn't a lot of talk about him. But later on, John figured out that Jimmy Doolittle was part of MJ-12. MJT. So MJT is my initials. And MJ-12 stands for Mars Jupiter 12. Well, it's very interesting because basically I've been getting signals from people up in high places, and that was one of Trump's signals in the rally last night that he gave, where he was wearing the garbage uniform. If you look on the garbage uniform, there was an M on the top, there was a T on the bottom, and if you split it down the middle, there's a J that splits both ways, because that's the initial that Donald J. Trump and I share, is the J. So MJT has high significance, because if you take the Mars Jupiter 12, you add the 1 and the 2, then you got 3. So this comes back to the Neil thing in the Trinity. These people like to use signs and symbols to talk to other people, and I'm reading it loud and clear. So basically, the MJ-12 was a secret group that was designed to reverse engineer the UFOs that they had recovered, and just to figure out what to do with all this technology stuff that they were tapping into. So when they were trying to do all this anti-gravity back in the 50s, they were pulling all these companies together, and the Learjet Corporation was one of the companies that they brought into the mix to help with their anti-grav. So John Lear's father didn't talk much about the anti-gravity. John basically had to figure out stuff on his own. So when John Lear began his career, he started flying, and he was doing work basically for the CIA, where they were loading up small arms in his planes, and he would say that he's doing agricultural mission or something like that, or just a cover story, and then they would run the arms in and drop them off and leave. So this has connections to northern Michigan here and Oscoda Air Force Base that the Air Force pulled out of a while ago, and this airline actually moved in there. So I'll tell this story reading from what John was talking about here. Basically, there was a book that came out talking about this whole CIA deal. They had to make a correction in the book because they were calling the guy John Lear's brother, not John. So they made the publication, and before it went to print, and changed it. So it says it's a book called Private Warriors by Ken Silverstein. John Lear Sr. runs from Budapest to Jeddah, arms to Mogadishu. And they're talking about a different airline. Okay, this is what I'm talking about with the deal in Oscoda. So they say a different airline. The torpedoes were picked up at an airfield near Gdansk and flown to Andrews Air Force Base by Kalia Commercial Freight Shipper. But he says it's not Kalia, it's Kaleta. Because the guy that runs it, his name's Connie Kaleta, and that was his boss. So John is talking about Connie Kaleta here. Now Connie Kaleta, if you don't know who he is, he was a famous drag racer that set all these speed records. Connie Kaleta has Kaleta Air, and right now they're running their operations out of Oscoda Air Force Base after the Air Force picked up and pulled out of there. So it's very interesting because I actually know somebody that's related to him here in town. And Oscoda Air Force Base is huge. So they're still running their freight, apparently. So how this whole story progresses is fast forward now to 1987, and John Lear is doing all these UFO lectures and giving all these talks at like libraries and stuff like that, kind of small venues, because he had amassed this huge collection of UFO data and videos and just stuff that people was giving him, stuff he was collecting. And it was starting to really catch on. So George Knapp was talking to John Lear back then and doing these interviews with John on Las Vegas News. So John, back in 1987, gets this call, and at this point the hype was getting really overwhelming for him and his wife wanted him to stop doing the whole UFO thing and stop talking, so she almost threw out all his stuff. But this one day, this guy named Gene Hoff, he calls up John Lear and says, "John, can I get some of your UFO tapes and some of your material?" He says that he just wants that stuff and is wondering if he'll maybe trade some work, because Gene Hoff was doing house appraisals. So he was wondering if John Lear would trade a house appraisal for some tapes. And John was like, I don't know if I want to do that, but then he agreed to do it. So little time went by, and Gene Huff came over to John Lear's to do the house appraisal and to get some UFO tapes. Well, he brought a guy with him, and it just so turns out that that guy was Bob Lazar. Before anybody knew who Bob Lazar was. Okay, Bob Lazar was working at Los Alamos and held a Q clearance. So Los Alamos National Labs is supposedly where they were making the 115. And that's how he got it, as the story goes. So this wasn't known at the time. So Bob calls complete bullshit on everything that John and Gene Huff are talking about, because they're talking about UFOs and this and that, and Bob just straight out says that there's nothing to it, and that he would have known about it because he held a Q clearance at Los Alamos, and he felt it was a high enough clearance to have at least some insight to what they're saying, because they're talking about all this stuff with people seeing all these discs out at Groom Lake and all this stuff. So Bob basically was a skeptic, and he calls him out on it. And what they did was John gave Gene the UFO tapes, and they gave Bob Lazar some stuff to go and research at Los Alamos to see if he could find some of these project names and some of the stuff that they were talking about. Well, all that stuff checked out, and it made Bob start to really question everything. So what had happened was, when Bob was working at Los Alamos, he built this jet-powered car, and the jet-powered car was featured in the Los Alamos paper. So by synchronicity, the same day the paper came out, Ed Teller was given a lecture, and he was supposed to be there that day. So Bob knew he was going to give this lecture, and he wanted to see it. So he got there a little bit early, and to Bob's surprise, Ed Teller is standing out front, and he's reading the very paper that Bob's on the front page of with his rocket car. So Bob walks up to him and introduces himself as the person that he's reading about in the paper. And they exchange information or whatever, and a little while goes on later, and then this is when Bob Lazar meets John Lear. Okay, so then Bob wanted to try and get in the inside at Area 51. So he got a hold of Ed Teller, and Ed told Ed Teller that he wants to work at Groom Lake. And so basically what had happened was Ed Teller set up these interviews for Bob to go work out there. Bob had 3 interviews set up at this place called EG&G. It's right at McCarran Airport, and they do all the hiring and all the interview process for all the employees at Area 51. But Bob didn't work at Area 51, he worked at S4. It's like 15 miles south near Papoose Lake, so there's a difference. There's people that worked at Area 51, and then you would go to Area 51 and then jump on this bus with blacked out windows and all this stuff. After you would get off the Janet flights, because they had this other separate airline that would leave Las Vegas carrying only Area 51 employees, and it's called Janet Airlines. So Bob goes to these interviews, and this is funny because on the second basically, they were all technical interviews about information, and Bob said that he said he aced the first one, but on the second interview, he said that the first question they asked him was, "Do you know John Lear, and what's your relationship with him?" He said, "Yes, I know him, and I think he sticks his nose into places it doesn't belong. What I didn't tell them is I also like to stick my nose in places where it doesn't belong." So Bob Lazar and John Lear are on the same page that I'm on. Because that's exactly how I felt with this whole thing when I was recording all this stuff with my camcorder. I felt like I was doing what these guys are going to be doing in the story here, where they're going out to the desert and they're trying to capture these craft on tape. So, this is how it goes. Bob Lazar gets in the Area 51, goes to S4, and then he starts reporting back to John Lear what's going on out in the desert. And he shows up at John Lear's house to tell him some stuff, and John Lear's like, "What are you doing here? You know that they're gonna follow you, and then you know they're probably listening." What John Lear didn't know at the time was that they had wired his whole house, literally wired it, and he was under heavy surveillance this whole time, and so was Bob. So everything that was going on with Bob's telephone and everything was being monitored. And they told him this, when they did all their briefings, I'm sure, at the beginning. Because this is the highest of the high classification stuff that the government has. So on December 6, 1988, Bob tells John that he saw a disc. And John says, "Was it ours or theirs?" And he says, "It was theirs." He said, "I saw it, I felt it, I touched it, I was in it." And that's Bob Lazar's quote. Because John Lear was either recording or writing all this stuff down anytime Bob Lazar would come back to his house and report on it. So he took highly detailed notes. And John was like, "What are you doing here telling me all this stuff? Why didn't you go back there and work for a while longer and then come back and report?" And Bob Lazar's reply was, "John, I saw you take so much crap in the last 4 to 5 months that I wanted to tell you it was real." So this guy went from a total skeptic to a believer. And basically Bob only went out to work there like 6 or 7 times. So, like I said, this began right before Christmas 1988, and then lasted shortly into 1989. So this is when they started going out to the desert, John and Bob and some of his friends, because they told Bob when they were going to be doing some of the test flights. So he only saw, actually, I believe, one test flight at the base, to where he was on the ground and watched the whole operation of it pick up and then do some maneuvers with it, and then it set back down. But he couldn't figure out how they were talking or controlling it or whatever, because he couldn't figure out the whole thing with how any signal could get into the basically the electromagnetic barrier that the craft was producing. But if you're using scalar communications, that's not a problem. So there was things Bob didn't understand when he was out there, but we understand now. So on March 21st, 1989, he was told about a test flight at 9 o'clock. So they took this road northeast of Groom Lake, and they camped out there and they watched some stuff, but it wasn't nothing really major. But it did come up over the mountain and they did see it. So then they went back on March 22nd, 1989. They had a telescope set up Um, they saw it come up behind the mountains for like 10 or 15 minutes and just hovered and kind of did some maneuvers. John had it in his Celestron telescope in view, but then he went to show it to somebody else and he kicked the telescope tripod and they didn't get like any good footage of it, and they left the camcorder on the bumper of the car or something, and they just didn't get anything good. So they go back out there, and this time was April 6, 1989. So 3 times a bunch of people went out there trying to see these things, and Bob wasn't supposed to be telling everybody that these tests were going on, but he was. So this is just further verification that Bob Lazar is telling the truth. Because how would he know when all these tests are going on? So on April 6, 1989, there was 5 people, and they took a Geiger counter, and they had like a camcorder, a telescope, and Bob's 9mm. So they were heading there to go and try and get some more footage or whatever, and they didn't make it to their destination. They saw 2 sets of headlights coming at them, so they turned around to head back toward the highway, and they realized that they were going to be caught by these 2 vehicles. So they stopped, and Bob Lazar jumped out of the car with his pistol, and he ran way into the desert, and John Lear jumped out and started setting up his telescope. And these 2 vehicles pulled up and stopped real fast, and John put his hands on the hood and said, "What are you doing?" And he says, "We thought that you guys were doing some kind of a deal or something, and there was something nefarious going on, and we just didn't know who you were, and it was security. Probably like the Camel dudes or whatever you hear about now." And basically, they stopped him and detained him for a minute. They asked him for a driver's license and social security number, social security card, but they were on BLM public land, so they really couldn't do anything. So the security guys left after about 15 minutes, and Bob came back out of the desert, and what had happened was that Bob says if he was about ready to take one of these security guys out, he said he was lined right up on him, and so what had happened was they all basically kind of got back together and jumped back in the car, and what they didn't know was that all these security had just turned around, and then they shut everything off, and they were still watching, recording him and listening to him on his parabolic mic. So what had happened was they all jumped back in the car and they started heading back toward the highway. Well, the sheriff was there waiting for him, and then he stopped him, and he walked up to the car and he said, "I have 2 questions for you." He says, "Why is there 5 people in the car now instead of 4? And where's the 9mm?" Which they had locked in the trunk. So the sheriff made him sit there because he was trying to get a warrant for the gun in the trunk, and they wouldn't do it. They said, go get your warrant. They wouldn't let the sheriff just look. So after an hour or so, the sheriff, he couldn't really do anything. So he gets a call from Area 51 base, and they tell him just to let them guys go. So the sheriff says, "I don't know why I'm being told this, but I'm being told to let you guys go." So he didn't search the trunk, and everybody took off. So the next morning, Bob Lazar gets this call at his house, and it's Dennis Mariana. Dennis is his boss at Area 51 or S4 or whatever, and he tells him not to get on the airplane, don't get on the Janet at McCarran to go to Area 51. He says that he's going to pick him up personally. So Dennis Mariana picked up Bob the next day, and they drove out to a place called Indian Springs. It's the center for intel at the base. When Bob got out of the car, they had a gun pointed at his head, and when Bob actually did one of these interviews with George Knapp, that was the name that he used, was Dennis, his boss, as kind of like a pseudonym, because he didn't want to give away his real name, so he called himself Dennis, because this is just another example of how these guys were trolling the government. So they're at this Indian Springs, and they tell him, Bob, now, when we gave you this job, we told you not to tell all your friends about the flying saucers. He says, if you still want to work here, you can work here, but there's some other stuff going on. Because basically they had tapped his phone, and they knew his wife was having an affair with her flight instructor at the time. And they didn't think he was like real stable because of all this stuff. And they asked him if he wanted to come back or whatever, and Bob was non-committal, because John said what had happened. He was giving John the whole lowdown when he was going out there. So basically, Bob said the last 2 times that he went out to work at S4 that he could remember getting on a 737 at McCarran and getting off it, but he couldn't remember anything in between, what he was doing at work. And it really freaked him out. So they were obviously doing something to Bob, and he didn't like that. So a week after this, Bob had his tire shot out of his car. So he stayed at John Lear's house that night, and Bob said he was going to turn himself in, but John said, to who? So that was John's joke that night to Bob Lazar. So he said the next Sunday, John was going to do a show with George Knapp called On the Record. So this is with George Knapp's Las Vegas news reporting. So then, basically, what had happened is that they did all these different interviews, and one was actually done in John Lear's house. So what had happened was that Bob had got some element 115 obtained from Los Alamos National Labs, because apparently somebody that he knew worked there and was basically doing the machining process on it, and to cut these things into triangles, and because it was quite a arduous process. So what they were doing was they were trolling the government so hard in one of these interviews that they actually put the 115 right in the shot of the camera on a bookcase behind Bob, just as a big up to the government. So they put it right in plain sight. And I'm going to show you something right here, proving what Bob's talking about. Bob had on camcorder, and he says this part of it got erased. But to all y'all that think 115 didn't exist, it does. And you can see these 3 triangle things. That's in a cloud chamber test that Bob Lazar was doing. And like I said, my camcorder don't lie, and neither does Bob Lazar's. So there you can see the light band and the reaction that is going on there. So there's proof you're 115 right there. Not a joke. And the way that John Lear described it, how the whole thing works with the anti-grav and the reactor and the craft, was basically this craft was set up for smaller beings. It was the furniture was small, Bob said, and he was basically only, his compartmentalization was just dealing with the propulsion system. So here's how their definition of this thing worked. The antimatter reactor, okay, so it was just this sphere, about the size of like a basketball or something, and the 115 is the element that supposedly the United States government had a fairly large supply of this stuff. So they would put the 115 into this reactor, and what they describe it is they shot protons into the tip of the sliver of 115, which would bump it up to 116, because 115 is stable, but 116 is unstable. The proton plugs into the 115 and makes it 116. It instantly decays back to 115. So that's how it's creating this field. So, and it radiates or throws off antimatter and the ability to access the gravity A wave. The reactor creates heat, which creates positive voltage, and they use that power to power the craft. But when the 116 decays to 115, they can actually pull out the gravity wave, the A wave, access it, amplify it, and then send it out into space to pull on space, to pull space towards them, to wrap it around the ship, and then they turn it off, and they're instantaneously 100,000 miles away, or whatever it says here. So it's like a slingshot effect. So as Bob describes it here, is that basically the craft would pick up and then it would tilt like this. Well, why is it tilting like this? And then he says the 3 points would start pulling on distant space, and then it would just be sucked towards it. So the reason why it pulls up like this is because of this right here. It's this effect right here. It's the same thing as my maglev pencil. It's pulling up, but then it's also being rested against this back. So it's going up and forward. So that's how you would want to first get your lift with your anti-grav, and then have your zero resistance going forward. So that's how they were describing it back then with the anti-gravity, because the Earth's just a giant magnet. All you're trying to do is break that pull from the Earth and get free of it. And when you can do that, then you can hit high speed, large distance. So this whole thing, the way it's working is basically when you're tapping into this thing, it recycles every 12 milliseconds, this reactor. So that's how fast the power would come back to it once it was spent, like a capacitor. You would charge up and then release, charge up and then release. So this thing's rebuilding every 12 milliseconds. And what Bob didn't really understand was this whole thing with the magnetism, because he actually describes it as just a repelling force, because he said they were doing all these experiments with the reactor itself, and they would try to put their hands on it and it would repel it. Well, it's doing the same thing as my magnetic propulsion system is doing. it's basically putting out what the earth puts out, dielectricity. But Bob's hand is running electromagnetism. Those are two complete opposites. So it's kind of like two of the same poles on a magnet. When you try to put them together, they're going to want to repel because dielectricity repels electromagnetism. And that's how this whole thing is working. That's what Bob didn't understand. Because not very many people do. So the whole deal with this 115 starts to get even more interesting because Bob and everything that he's saying is now at this moment being proven true on all the 0-point energy stuff that's being discovered with the MH370 investigation. Bob at S4 held an MAJ clearance. MAJ, like magic. His number was E-4722MAJ, U.S. Department of Navy. So that's what it said on his W-4s, who he was getting paid from. So basically, he had this 115, and as the story goes, they were having all these near run-ins or whatever, and all this weird stuff happening, so they got rid of the 115. What they did with it, I have no idea, but they basically, I heard, buried it somewhere where you can't get at it. It's inaccessible. So fast forward this whole thing to July 19th, 2017, during the filming of the documentary that Jeremy Corbell was doing on Bob Lazar. Okay. And the government had been trying to get at Bob and his 115 for a long time. So I think this is when they did the setup with Jeremy Corbell trying to get Bob Lazar to say something about the 115 or to try to do something, because he had this deal where somebody said that basically Bob sold something from his company, because he runs United Nuclear here in Michigan, near Lansing. So Bob's not far away. He's less than 4 hours away from me. But basically they were saying that Bob had sold something and then somebody ingested it and had some bad stuff happen to him. And they were investigating that, but that's not what they were looking for. They were looking for the 115. So Jeremy Corbell shows up and boom, all this stuff happens. Well, the backstory on Jeremy Corbell, as it turns out, that I've heard from the grapevine, is that John Lear was letting this dude stay on his couch. So he was probably gathering all this intel and maybe snooping around for that 115, I think. I could be wrong. But, and then he shows up and this whole raid happens with the FBI and Bob Lazar. So they showed up with a hazmat team, and Lazar says, I don't want to get in any trouble. So he just played ball with them and he let them search everything. And they didn't apparently find anything. So I found this, a bunch of different interviews, and I'm going to read the quotes from these interviews to prove that 115 was a real thing. It might not be Moscovium or whatever they're saying it is today, but I guarantee that this stuff was in existence. So, here it goes. Question at early Lazar interview. I understand that you took some 115 home with you to run some tests of your own. Bob says, I obtained it, yeah. Question, did you document any of your testing? He says, yeah. He says, you did? He says, yeah, mostly videotape and things like that. John said it was stolen from you. They stole it back, and Bob says, there's another level to that. Right now, that it's in private hands. Okay? Another question from the interviewer. Question, what about the 500 pounds? He says it's raw and it has to be cut into discs and stacked and sliced along the long axis of it. That work is done at Los Alamos, and that's where he previously worked, Los Alamos National Labs, or LANO for short. This interview is called Bob Lazar Area 51 Special Part 1. So he says, I don't know what Los Alamos thinks we're doing. They think at Los Alamos they are working with some new type of armor. So the people that are making the 115, they think they're actually making new type of armor. So that's how they are keeping this whole thing secret. And so basically, Bob Lazar just says he knows people that were working in that area, and that's how I obtained it and came of it. So Bob Lazar says, they say did the cloud chamber they did the cloud chamber experiments and bent light around the 115, as you can see in the footage that was taped. And then, so it's real. And here's from George Knapp. So this is how this whole thing ties in, and maybe why George Knapp is doing what he's doing now, with saying that everything's aliens. But George Knapp personally saw it. George claims it was buried, and after Bob dies, he's probably gonna go dig it up. So that's pretty telling there. Knapp Bob said the key to it was the 115. He had a piece of it. I saw it. In fact, he had a little experiment with what he called the cloud chamber, and it looked like the light. He had a piece of 115 in his chamber. They put some smoke in it, and it seemed to bend the beam of light through it. They passed the beam of light, and basically the beam bent. So he had that piece. I saw the experiment. What had happened to it, he says, that's a story for another time. So he's basically saying that he'll go dig it up when Bob's gone. So that's the whole story, basically, of the 115, and why I believe that the whole thing happened back in 2017 with the FBI raid on Bob's property was because of that. So you can see how all these players kind of tie into this whole thing with the anti-grav and how they've tried to keep the stuff under wraps the best they could. But it's all coming out now and the floodgates are open. The 0 point's been figured out. The public is finally catching on to it and they're eager to learn more. So I'm just glad that everything that I put into the mix is finally paying off and the right people are figuring it out and understanding it and they're putting it out to more people and it's just a domino effect at this point. So that's my story on the 115. Bob Lazar. He's the real deal. Thanks for watching. If you haven't seen my other videos, please check them out. Peace.